Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of 401 Access Denied. Really excited to have another exciting couple of guests with me today. My name is Joseph Carson, Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Thycotic and based in Tallinn, Estonia. So really excited to have another guest who's returning today. And it's always great when we have fantastic guests come back on the show. So, Jon, do you want to give us an intro and let new guests know who you are and a little bit about your background, please?
Yeah, sure. Last time was so much fun. I was really excited to come back and have another conversation. Jon Ramsey, I was formerly the Chief Technology Officer for SecureWorks, a managed security service provider, for 21 years. Prior to that, I was at the Computer Emergency Response Team at Carnegie Mellon University, where I also did my master's work at CMU in software engineering. And then prior to that, at Siemens Corporate Research.
Awesome. Welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure to have you back again. And we're here with a new guest in the episode. So, Juan, welcome to the show. Hopefully, this is going to be an interesting and fun conversation for today. So, can you give us a little bit about who you are and your background, please?
Sure, Joe. Thank you very much for having me in the show. Really looking forward to share some of my thoughts about cybersecurity in OT with you guys. And thank you for having me. So, Juan Espinosa, I'm a Parsons employee, specialized in cybersecurity for OT systems. Been with Parsons 8 years, doing a lot of work for the intelligence community, protecting critical networks. Think about air conditioning systems for data centers, generators, and things like that. Um, Before that, I spent 15 years of my life building American embassies. So I travel all over the world, kind of building the infrastructures. That was fun. And they have a growing family, and they decided to change and do something that require less travel. So I'm here in the Maryland area, and learning every day about cyber is one of those things that you never become a true expert. You really learn every day. So looking forward for this conversation. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Welcome to the show. And I couldn't agree more with you. Cybersecurity, there is no one person who knows everything. It's always a continuous learning. And I've been in the industry for close to 30 years, and I'm still learning. And I can never, I specialize in certain areas, but I can never be an expert in everything. That's why I surround myself with amazing, talented people that when I have a question, I go to them for it. And for the audience for today's show, we're going to be going into operational technology, OT. And I know we've had episodes before, which some of the well and greatest performing episodes were all in operational technology, and we've talked about sciences and data, and we talked about production lines and other we talked about attacks on oil rigs and so forth. So we've had a lot of interesting discussions. But I think it's been quite a while since we've had that OT discussion. So I thought it was really important to bring back some extreme intelligent guests to come in and help provide us an update into where we are today. So one of the things is that with OT, it's always advancing, it's always evolving, especially in the cybersecurity. And we've seen a lot of major incidents in the past year. So I'd like to kind of get, one, if you can provide us kind of, let's say, current state of the union type of thing into what is operational technology, so people can kind of get an understanding, what it means.
Sure, absolutely. So think about the Internet of Things, right? The common term, think about the convenience that you have when you forgot to close the garage door in your house, and then you have the ability to close it from remote from your cell phone, right? Think about a security camera in your ring bell in your door, and then you can check if your kids arrive safe home from your office computer, right? So that convenience, that connectivity relies on a holistic network of IT and OT devices, right? So think about that example. In the example of the garage door, you have an OT device, which is the classic, like, think about the engine, the motor that is activating the door to open. Think about the example of the camera. You have the actual camera, right? OT devices that are talking with a special communication protocol. But then the ability of those devices to be controlled from remote is basically leveraging the internet and an IT network behind it, right? So in that example, you're using the convenience of the system, right? However, security was never considered in the development. Security is a new thought, right? And now all of a sudden you have a network that is all connected and is full of entry points and plenty of vulnerabilities to exploit. Now think about industrial installations. They were not any different. They were developed with convenience in mind, with the facility to save money, right? So automation was great, and that was the rush of a lot of companies to automate, connect things, so you will save money. So think about having data and control coming to your centralized station. That will save you money because you don't have to send technicians all over the country in a truck with a notepad taking the measurement of a power meter, right? All that is
Mhm.
automated now. So that convenience and that, simplicity and efficiency was captured with a all connected network. And in the Internet of Things now, so much as in industrial control systems, you have the same issue. Everything's connected, ITOT, you cannot tell the difference. So convenience came to a price, with a price, the price of cybersecurity. And that is our role now, trying to protect something that was not designed with security in mind.
Absolutely. John, any things that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating time, the convergence of IT and OT and the ramifications of that convergence. Both positive and negative. I mean, you take the power industry for example. It's a lot cheaper to shed power into the ground instead of store it in a battery and store it in a battery. It's cheaper to reproduce the power than to have to store it. And
Mhm.
so because the production and consumption side are not technically driving demand across one another, you have this problem where power companies are shedding some percentage of their power in the ground, or they're trying to store it by pumping water up a hill and turning it
Mhm.
into potential energy, as an example. And so here you bring in IT, and now you can directly connect the production and the consumption together in the power industry and be able to now not have to generate or consume as many natural resources
Mhm.
because you have more real-time decisions being made. And so there's definitely upside, but as Juan said, that comes with incremental risk, and the risk to me in this case is really, when we think about security from a cyber perspective, we tend to think about confidentiality, integrity, and
Mhm.
availability. And the OT side, when a OT system doesn't have confidentiality, integrity, or availability, then what happens? Does it become a life safety issue?
Mhm.
And that's really like the ramification of the influx of IT technology into OT systems. Is now it's become like
Mhm.
clearly a safety issue.
Yeah. Absolutely. So when I think about, I've been involved in many different projects over the years, and really interesting, exciting ones. I've been involved in, autonomous shipping projects. So we're really taking large, massive, vessels and actually, making them autonomous. And with live projects we've seen in Finland, where we've had tugboats and we've had car ferries being completely automated in regards to being able to, do their jobs. I've also been involved into the mineral industry as well, where
Mm.
we've had mining trucks completely, now not fully autonomous, they're mostly remotely operated, but again the same technology, the same ability in order to make people being able to operate those trucks. And I think really where I've seen a lot of these advancements was focused around the safety side of things. It was all about taking people out of high risk places and putting them in safe places to operate those technologies. And one of the first that I ever got involved into actually goes back into the early 2000s. When I got involved, I used to be responsible for an ambulance service. And
Mm.
when I was responsible, so for ambulances, so you basically have to provide ambulances to different areas, and then those ambulances pick up the patients, or the victims, and they would transport them to the emergency room. And then basically once they arrived, the doctors would basically perform emergency services. And but I saw there was a major gap between the ambulances, where they're en route to the hospitals, and basically the data that the paramedics were collecting could have been actually vital if it actually already had visibility of the surgeons and the emergency services before they got there.
Yeah,
So technology
brilliant.
it was back in 2000, and we had these new defibrillators and EPGs that actually had data cables that you can actually, but the data cables, the purpose of those was to connect them directly to things like printers and fax machines in the emergency rooms. So what I saw was an opportunity, and then was I took old Nokia telephones that had data cables, which was sitting on edge computing, connected it to the defibrillators, And we literally made basically the defibrillators act in that through that Nokia phone back into the emergency room that actually provided the data, the live data of the patient 15 minutes before they even arrived at the hospital. So the doctors could look at that data and already start analyzing and prepping the rooms before they arrived. And that was kind of so from when I look at back then, but going to your point, that security was not the focus. It wasn't the primary focus was to make it work, to make sure we're able to take data from one location and make it available to another person who makes those critical decisions and makes the prep. So when I think about all of these areas of OT, and that was probably my very first really introduction where you're taking technology that was not necessarily internet connected, but it started having the ability to connect it through data services and mobile phones and everything else. And of course, now they naturally have it embedded and available. So that was kind of my first introductions and really got me thinking about, and later when I look at, from 2000, that was in early 2000s where we started connecting ambulances. And when you think about today, it's so, I mean, I see, to your point, John, it's so exciting that the technology and the convergence, but at the same time, as I'm excited about seeing all of this evolution, I'm also scared. I also
Yeah.
have a scare because when I get into, I recently wrote, so just to give you an example, I recently wrote a very in-depth blog, it hasn't been released yet, but it'll be released very soon. I'm sitting here surrounded by devices that I've pulled apart and have been connecting things to UART ports, and I'm also sitting with my logic analyzers as well, where I plug into everything and try to analyze the data. But the blog was really getting into where when we look at these devices, whether it being IoT connected devices that are just providing, let's say, temperature data or lighting information or traffic flow, all of them, they're designed for basically efficiency and cost. And security is not an element in any of them. It's added on after, it's tried to be patched later. It's tried to be added on after it's already been designed and in production. So can you get, looking at that one, I'd like to get some examples of what you've seen where IoT itself and OT has really been lacking in security areas. Do you have some examples that you would like to share with the audience where you've seen that security has been let's say sacrificed in many cases just for the efficiency of productivity?
Absolutely. Not only because of the sacrifice on productivity, but also because or pure obsolescence, right? Like
Mhm.
think about elevators in every building, right? That's the classic example that we always
Yeah.
find. They're designed for a useful life for 30 years, right? So picture yourself going through an assessment on cybersecurity and taking a look of an elevator that is 20 years old, right? So you walk with the building owner in charge of the maintenance, and he says, "Oh, the elevator is working great, right? You see, 20 years, I have 10 more years of useful life. For me, it's great, right? I don't have any comments whatsoever with the functionality of the elevator." And then you go and talk to the cybersecurity guy in charge of the cybersecurity of their building, right? And then who will check the elevator, and most likely it will be running on an antiquated operating system. Think about XP, right? So the cyber guy will say, "Hey, I mean, no way, right? I mean, XP is not supported anymore by Windows. I can not deploy any security patches to it. It really represents a liability from the point of view of cybersecurity." But not only that, in addition to that, the elevator needs to be connected to the fire suppression system of the building. Because in the case of an emergency in fire, those things need to be connected and monitored from remote, right?
Mhm.
So the cybersecurity guy is saying your elevator is a liability not only for the elevator itself, it's a liability for the whole building when it comes to cybersecurity. So what do you do, right? I mean, are you going to change the whole elevator when you still have 10 more years of
Mhm.
useful life? Probably not, right? So then you have the classic IT/OT dilemma, right?
Mhm.
Who's right and who's wrong? And that's the classic, right? Those two employees of that company, they work in different departments, they have different priorities, and they have different standards when it comes to cybersecurity. So in those cases, we sometimes recommend simple solutions that are not high tech at
Mhm.
all. We just simply say, "Hey, let's put a lock in the controller of the elevator," right? And then they develop a process to who has access to it, right? That way you will satisfy to a point the cybersecurity concern, and you can still use the elevator for another 10 years, right? So So that's the challenge, right? There's different priorities, there's different groups that see the same issue in a different way. So one is functionality and the other one is IT cybersecurity.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that just the cultural difference there is you have an IT person look at a thermostat on the wall and go, I know there's something broken about it. We're gonna have to update it. And the OT person looks at it and goes, it's not broken, don't fix it. The temperature in here is perfect. And the two approaches really like culturally conflict with one another. And that's, there has to be some dialogue and shared language between the IT and the OT person to be able to to
Mhm.
to understand exactly what they're both valid to understand exactly where that's coming from. And the IT world, back to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we tend to think more about confidentiality and integrity. And in the OT world, availability is
Yeah.
king. Like
The
availability is
safety,
the thing.
availability.
It
Yeah.
has to be up all the time.
Yeah.
And so if it's up and it's working, it's doing its job, why introduce the risk of changing and breaking it and making it unavailable now? And so
Absolutely.
it's an interesting balance.
Yeah, I think the dilemma has been in the last 10 to almost 15 years. The dilemma is starting to increase because I think to both your points is absolutely is. I remember kind of just for the audience. I probably mentioned this before. Is that IT seems to is much faster moving. We tend to recycle things every 3 to 5 years. People
Mhm.
get new laptops, upgrade their operating systems, get new mobile phones. We patch systems, almost on a monthly basis or every patch Tuesday. So things in IT, they may not appear to be very fast. 3 years waiting for a new phone could be extremely lifetime for many people. But in the IT, that's fast. But we look at OT, and I look at the complete opposite side of the spectrum. And I
Yeah.
remember years ago getting the opportunity to go watch the satellite decommissioning process. And the person was mentioning is that this button was designed 30 years ago. And this is the button that sets off the decommissioning process. And
Wow.
they hope
Yeah.
that the design of 30 years ago, and it might even be longer because, by the time they implemented and I think the satellite was originally planned for 20 years and had now been orbiting for 25. And now they're going, we hope all of this works. And it was, that process would set off to make sure that the satellite would move to what was called as the decommissioning orbit, where
Yeah.
basically where rubbish floats around, and that it had to be exactly empty and fuel by the time it got to that point. So, but this was all designed 30 years ago. And we think about, in OT, things are meant to last for a long time. We look at, even I mentioned, mineral trucks. We look at maritime ships. We look at airplanes. You know, airplanes, we see planes flying that's, 20, 30 years old. We see vessels even older than that. So in that area, it means that, that technology, it's always about cost, production, safety. The elements of the focus and priorities are very, very different from that in IT. So that kind of gets into that, that counter, that basically I think that when we have that different opinions, or we get two people from the different views, is that their priorities and viewpoints are very, very different. So that becomes a major challenge. But I think going to your point about the elevator scenario is that all of a sudden somebody decides, well, let's connect something else. Let's put a camera in that elevator and connect it to the same machine. And all of a sudden, now it's not just maybe isolated. That elevator now becomes internet connected. Same in the vessel side of things is that we might have a SCADA control system that's providing diagnostics data back to command and control center, but now we need to have that diagnostics going to the vendor because the vendor owns the data. So we're starting to see contractual difference as well. Because if you buy a ship's engine today, or even a power station engine, you might own the physical device, but you don't own the data. Contracts are starting to change, especially in OT, even with vehicles and cars. And we're starting to see you might own the physical hardware, but you don't own the data that has been generated. And what that means is that you have to provide connectivity back to the manufacturer, back to the production. They might also provide services to provide services and maintenance. So you actually have to provide that data and access back to the company who's providing that. And that's where we start seeing these devices, which were meant to have long life cycles, are now getting connected to the internet to provide that access. And I think that's where we start that's where that conflict between the IT person saying, now it's connected, now it's exposed, now the risk is much greater. We had to find a balance between how do we reduce that risk. So I'm just interested in any thoughts around, those different viewpoints in those scenarios, because of course we're starting to see, more connectivity. I think we're seeing a lot more on the consumer side, but definitely in industry, in manufacturing, that's starting to accelerate very, very quickly. And I don't think right now we're prepared yet, from a security perspective, to reduce that risk. I think that risk, that security is being added afterwards, especially after incidents happen. So, just interested, maybe one, you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, yeah, you brought up a very good point, which is in OT, like you highly depend on vendors, right? Because sometimes the providers of the automation, and then think about like Honeywell, Allen Bradley,
Hmm.
Siemens, those guys not only use the data, like you said, but they own a proprietary communication system, right?
Yes.
That's what they're selling you, right? They'll send you their proprietary technology. So you don't own that. So because you don't own it, it's very difficult for you to provide the security associated with that particular device. So you rely on the Siemens of the world to come to your facility, um, to deploy security patches, to generate
Hmm.
upgrades, even for maintenance, right? So, and it's not one or two. I mean, in OT, you're relying on hundreds of vendors in a single facility,
Hmm.
right? So you cannot ignore that fact that you're constantly having companies coming and connecting to your network, right? So you're not air gapped. Like air gapped in OT, just that concept doesn't exist, right? Because you rely on
Yes.
those vendors. You don't have a choice, right? So instead of ignoring that fact, instead of living in a world in which you feel that you're air gapped, like in an IT system, that you might easily
Mhm.
develop a series of firewalls and protect your boundaries and things like that. OT is not like that, right? You depend and you rely on those vendors. So the only choice is for you to acknowledge that fact and develop your security around integrating those vendors into your processes, right? So think about, if you and you mentioned the internet, right? Like
Mm.
in theory, a critical network shouldn't be connected to the internet. And then you see cases in which it happens, right? But
Yes.
let's assume for 1 second that you're not connected to the internet, that your vendors actually physically come to your facility with their laptops and they want to deploy maintenance and patches to their assets, right? You need to integrate that process into your own security protocols,
Mhm.
right? Maybe you have a mechanism in which you make sure that that laptop that they're connected is scan for viruses. It's a laptop that has control for only that piece of equipment and so forth, right? You develop your processes around the fact that you have people connecting. Maybe you close every unused port in your facility. You
Mhm.
only let those guys use a single port, and you make sure that the rest of the ports in your endpoints are closed, right? Uh, Maybe you develop training for those guys, right? That you make sure that they understand that they cannot connect um, personal devices when they're doing that exercise. Maybe you
Mhm.
assure that they don't have any email or
Mm.
instant messaging in the computer that they're connecting. I mean, there's things that you can do about it if you think about this issue holistically, right? You need to work with the vendors and understand that an OT network is very different from an IT network,
Mhm.
and your operations need to understand that, right? The challenge, though, is typically security policies are issued by the IT department. So then you're trying to impose security, and the OT guys just struggle trying to understand those requirements, right?
Yes.
So your policy needs to include that acknowledgement that you depend on vendors, that you're different, and then that's the only way to secure it.
Yeah. Just one of the thoughts, before John, just kind of while I'm on this point, and I'll move over to you, is that when I think about it, sometimes we've taken this approach to the past where it's segmentation. I've always taken an approach where you have production servers, you've got production desktops and clients, and maybe mobile devices. You have BYOD, you have UAT, you have backup. I was always in a kind of methodology of segmentation that they should never be on the same LAN, and they always have strong access controls between all of them. And I kind of get in that same thought process that, well, IT and OT need to have that same. We need to have the segmentation. We need to have strong, because when it gets to your point, it's hard to put security into that OT environment, into the actually processes, into the systems, because they are proprietary. They might be legacy. They might be old. Does that mean that we have to think about putting security around it, and minimizing that way? To your point, the ports, how people access, because when you have people coming in, that to me is, you already that's no longer air gapped. When you have people go, that's basically no longer an air gap system. So just has to, John, maybe you have some thoughts along that you want to follow up on from Juan's point before.
Yeah, no. Maybe you want to jump into some models or some.
Yeah, I mean, when you're right, absolutely right. It is a challenge to trying to bolt on security into an OT system, right?
Mhm.
So there is a concept that is being implemented nowadays, which is the concept of defense in depth. So it's a series of layers that the final goal is to protect the endpoints, right? Your most important assets, right? And that layered approach is exactly what you're saying. So you have a combination of methods, right? One method is clearly like standard operating procedures, right? Don't connect, USB ports. Don't use personal email in these networks and so forth. So there's a little bit of SOP involved with the operation of that network. But there's other concepts that are a little bit more technical, like to your point of separation.
Mhm.
So you should try to design your networks in a way that the operational function, the automation, is separated from the IT.
Mhm.
And that's, believe it or not, that's not the case nowadays. It's a lot cheaper
Right.
to exercise control and data acquisition from the IT devices, right? Because it's a lot cheaper, right? Instead of trying to design your own proprietary protocol. So nowadays technologies are highly reliable on the network piece of it. Think
Mhm.
about the IT piece of the ICS or OT network. And that's not good for security, because if the network fails, your function fails, right? So you need to find a way to separate those two things and keep the function separated
Mhm.
from the network. That's another concept. There are other concepts that had to do with like classic IT, the separation of networks. So a combination
Mhm.
of firewalls, maybe data diodes. There's a lot of good technology out there, right? Like I think the
Mhm.
challenge is that it's not totally integrated. There's individual vendors that sell individual tools for certain purposes, but there's still a clear silo between the IT and OT groups, right?
Mhm.
So you don't have a network that is all protected with a holistic approach, right? It's being patched, if you will. So maybe there's sections of the network that are newer, very well isolated, firewalled, uh, good SOPs. And then all of a sudden you have, like you said, a brand new system, maybe
Mhm.
security cameras that are included in that particular facility, and they wanted to connect that as well, right? So all of a sudden you have a new system that has not been designed that way, and then you almost need to start from zero, right? In,
Mhm.
in developing the firewalls, developing the SOPs for the vendors that take care of that section of the network. So it's a dynamic process, right? It never ends, right? It's like a
Yeah.
cycle. You constantly need to be reacting and not even thinking about vulnerabilities, right? Because they change over also every day. It's super dynamic.
Yeah.
Every day there's new vulnerabilities. So it's not like you patch once, you design your network, and then you can go. No, I mean you constantly need to be coming back to that 0 point in which
Yes.
you baseline again, and then you keep tracking for changes.
Yeah, because if you want to update something, it's production line. You're not updating one component. You have to stop
Exactly.
everything in the chain in order to replace one thing. I remember when they were doing some maintenance in the power station, and they had to shut the entire engine off just to change little components that had no impact to the engine at all. It's just that that whole thing is a system. It's a system in its entirety, not just one vendor's machine or one SCADA controller, one PLC, or one cable. Basically, that is seen as an entire system end to end. So any maintenance on it, it's the system that's impacted, not just the one vendor component.
Absolutely.
I think that there is an opportunity that exists that if we're going to get in front of it, in the long game, like this is a
Mhm.
long game thing because these systems are around forever,
Yes.
and there are a lot of systems that are already deployed. And as Juan has taught me so much about the space, they're in the operate and maintain sort of phase
Mhm.
of their life cycle. But there's a life cycle in front of that, which is the design and build life cycle. And I think that if as we are in the long game, I think now that we know so much more about how to secure technology, in the end, it's like as an IT practitioner, I look at it, I go, well, OT really, it's got hardware, it's got software, it's got data. How different is it really? It's different. It's really
It's very
different.
different.
And so what's important is like when we in the design and build stage, how do we how do we build it or design, by security,
Mhm.
design it in the beginning that enables options from a security perspective to do things when we're operating and maintaining it, because we know we're going to need to do things. So how do we
Absolutely.
make sure as a design and an architecture that we build a system that we can operate and maintain, and when we make
Mhm.
changes, the changes don't introduce more risk than they mitigate. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I
Mhm.
think there are companies like Parsons, for example, that have a philosophy around safety and building
Mhm.
safety and security and design in the early stages, so that when they also operate and maintain those networks, they can do it in a way that is that has more rigor and
Mhm.
is more natural than sort of ad hoc bolted on kind of
Yeah.
approaches.
Yeah, just to give you, I completely get it. I can give you a great example into how all of this, plays out. I really love the OWASP top 10 for IoT. It was a great
Yeah.
kind of showing people where they need to be thinking about, especially getting into that, security by design, security up front.
Hmm.
Years ago, doing some maritime engagements, specific maritime management company, that when doing the penetration tests, we find that they'd actually deployed in their office space smart light bulbs. And the smart light bulbs, basically, what we were able to do was basically, identify that it was using weak protocols, and then basically being able to connect. And we actually, had a Raspberry Pi pretending it was a light bulb. So all of a sudden, they had, hundreds of light bulbs deployed, and never recognized this additional light bulb appearing in the network, and then being able to use that to gather information, laterally move, and then kind of move across the network. And ultimately, kind of what it got down to it, and we reported the vulnerability back to the vendor, and the vendor came back and said, right, okay, here's a patch. You need to update the light bulbs. And when we looked at the process for that was to unplug the light bulb. There was a micro USB. You had to plug it in, connect it to the laptop, flash the firmware, take it out, replug the light bulb back in again. And on a company that had deployed hundreds of those things, it just became inefficient way at doing patch updates. That you had to physically go and take them all out, patch them, redeploy them again. And that's what we started seeing. And also, what we started seeing at the time was the smart hubs. I think this was really kind of a great kind of starting point where organizations and vendors who provide these devices started thinking about patch updates, started thinking
Yeah.
about secure connectivity, started thinking about better protocols. So this was kind of where we started seeing that introduction, where now the hub becomes the direct communication. The light bulb's not connected directly to the Wi-Fi network; it's connected to the hub, and the hub to the network. So therefore, it can able to manage, it can inventory, and it can also automatically deploy the patches. So those things, unfortunately, it's always after. It's after you find the vulnerability. So the question is, how can we get ahead of this? How can we get the vendors to really start thinking about it before when they get into the design process? Because when I get in those scenarios, it's always too late, and to change it is time consuming. That vendor had to they got rid of the light bulbs. They just could not, because it meant in between that time, they were vulnerable, and to replace all the light bulbs and flash firmware was very costly. It was more costly than light bulbs to do that process. So just interested in how we get manufacturers to think about this beforehand.
So there's a lot of like strategies that I
Mm.
think you can take to minimize that risk, and I like a lot the concept of security by design.
Mhm.
So it is in that stage in the design that you have the most opportunities to do things right, because then when you do them later, it's gonna be very difficult or super expensive. So I think the vendors are in a race for
Mhm.
cheap, connected, automated, right? And I don't think you can fight that battle, right?
Yes.
Because everybody's trying to offer you the simplest, more efficient, cheaper way to
Mhm.
connect, right? So I don't think that the battle that we need to fight as cybersecurity professionals is with the vendors.
Mhm.
I think it's with our own designs. So there is a concept, especially when it comes to OT, and John mentioned this really well, like, which is the concept of availability of your network or your system.
Mhm.
It needs to be available 24/7 for critical operations, right? Think about nuclear facilities, think about Department of Defense, think about critical networks, right? Uh, you need to build resiliency into your design from
Mhm.
the beginning. What do I mean by that? You need a system that is resilient to the attack. Not only you trying to avoid the attack, but you need to be resilient in the case that
Yes.
an attack actually happens, right? So you need to have like for instance, redundancy in your networks, right? Special components that are critical need to be designed with certain level of redundancy. And an example is the redundancy in the supply of power, for instance, right?
Hmm.
If you lose commercial power, you need to have the ability to get into the automatic transfer and then have the generators in your facility provide you with that power, right? So that's a simple concept of resiliency. However, some of the assets in your infrastructure are not designed with that. So one of the things that we look for in our assessments is we take a look of, say, PLCs, and we look behind the
Hmm.
box, and then you see that they have a single source of power, right? So they have one single way to
Hmm.
get power into that device. So even if you have the generator outside ready to give you power, that device is only getting the commercial power, right? So it's a
Hmm.
simple solution. Just buy the devices with dual sources of power, and then you connect one to the commercial power and the other one to the generators and UPSs, right? So that's an opportunity that you have only in the design phase, because when you have thousands of PLCs deployed in an OT installation, and then you're making an
Hmm.
assessment, it's very difficult to retrofit all that infrastructure when it's already operational, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the discovery and assessment of the vulnerability might be easy, but the opportunity is past, right? So
Yes.
that's a big call to say, hey, let's design these systems from the beginning. It wasn't expensive to buy the box with redundant power, right? It probably
Hmm.
would have been like, what, 5% more expensive, probably less, right? But it wasn't never thought at the beginning. Let's put it that way. Security
Hmm.
was never thought. It was just, let's automate, let's move quickly, let's make it efficient, let's integrate,
Yeah.
right? It was
And
never,
cost again.
are we
Hmm.
redundant? Are we resilient? Do we
Yeah.
have dual sources of power? And strategies that are not new, right? This has been in the market
Hmm.
for many years. It just need to be included into the design. That only the afterthought of security is just not efficient anymore,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. And John, just kind of just get your expertise. The one thing that we've seen a lot of major attacks and incidents in the past year on OT infrastructure, and just kind of your background in CERT and incident response. Is it very different in a OT environment that it is in a traditional IT? What's is there differences there? Maybe there's some
From an
kinetic damage, yeah, from this response.
yeah, I think from an incident response perspective, IT and OT is very, very different. Um, Generally, on the OT side of things, you have one button to push and you disconnect and shut everything down.
Hmm.
And in the incidents that are sort of happened historically and in recent history, most of the incidents have specifically still been contained to the IT side or the corporate side,
Hmm.
but have touched things that were closer to the OT side. And so usually as a means to mitigate any kind of further exposure, you tend to find you tend to find sort of proactive, take the OT systems or
Hmm.
disconnect the OT systems for a period of time. That's mostly on the industrial side. Now, ransomware and on the healthcare side um, has still also largely been in IT based systems, but
Hmm.
has had an impact on standard of care in healthcare. And so time is not on your side when you have a standard of care issue. Time isn't on your side when you're an incident anyway, but when there's life
Yeah.
on the line, you tend to have to think about the problem a little bit different. For me, whenever I am an incident commander and walk into an incident, IT or OT, I always ask the question is, what is the priority here?
Yeah.
Is the priority to get the systems back online, which would mean like you have to get to eviction day as soon as possible,
Hmm.
or is the priority to catch the infiltrator? And if the
Yeah.
priority is to catch the infiltrator, you might want to
Watch and
leave them
learn.
in the
Yeah.
environment for a
Yeah.
while and
Honeypots and watch
continue
and
to
learn. Yeah.
watch and learn. And so understanding the priority is really, really critical. And there's a different calculus on the OT
Hmm.
side than there is
Yeah.
on the IT side.
Yeah, it makes me think of some of the incidents we've seen in the past year where we really started seeing, that kinetic and human impact. When we've seen hospitals getting victims of ransomware, and you've got patients that's en route to that hospital and then have to be rerouted,
Yeah,
and time is critical. And you've seen patients, dying because of those reroutings. Absolutely, it becomes, for me, it's always the life and safety is always my top two priorities,
sure.
and that's where you make those decisions. And I get that a lot. When I think about I've had some incidents in the ambulance service where you have those situations. The system, my SLA in the ambulance service is 23 minutes. I'll for the rest of my life, I'll never forget my SLA for the ambulance service,
Yeah.
because after 23 minutes from that call into the emergency room,
Yeah.
and if the ambulance didn't get there in 23 minutes, the probability and likeliness of that person dying was
Dying. Yeah.
very high. And that was the SLA, was a life and death. So we knew that the minute the call came in, I had to do everything in my power in order to make sure that the ambulance got to that victim within 23 minutes, because that was the
Yeah.
difference
Yeah.
between life and death. And yeah, I mean, I've had times where we were doing it was back in the good old Y2K days, where we were basically updating systems from Y2K and moving systems over to new phases and generators. And we had a scenario where basically the systems were offline, and we could we had passed that 23 minutes. We were that was probably the worst night of my life, is when you knew that those systems that you had to get them back up as quick as possible, because it was a life and death scenario,
For sure.
and
For
that's always a
sure.
priority. So
It's the other thing, Joe, the other thing to incident response that is different is that IT typically the higher priority is confidentiality. So thinking about the data, right? I mean, if your network was compromised and you're getting asked for money for ransomware, uh, to recover the
mhm,
data because maybe you're concerned that they have financial data for your corporation, or maybe you have PPI information that is relevant for you. So you want to recover the data, right? You're
Yeah.
paying for the data back, right? So when the
mhm,
data is back, the data is back. I mean, immediately you have the data back in your servers. In the OT, though, when they interrupt the service, right? Those systems were not designed to be rebooted like that, right? So they might give you power back, they may give you the control back, it might take you weeks to recover, right? You need to
yes,
re-image all the computers again.
Yeah.
So, like, think about Colonial Pipeline. It took them a while to
yeah,
recover. I mean, even when they recover the control, it might still
mhm,
take weeks to take the operation back to the normal state. So the impact is completely different, right? And if you think about like national security, the risk is immense, right? Like
yes,
you need to protect all those critical systems 24/7, and you're not concerned about the data so much. The data that is circulating through those
yeah,
networks is maybe temperature data, valve pressure, things like
yes,
that. But if you lose control, recovering the control might take some time, right? And
Yeah.
that'd be a significant impact.
absolutely. And you can
Yeah.
also
It's
have
certainly on the.
damage as well. You
Sure.
can also have physical damage to the systems too that might need to be replaced.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I
you were
mean, on
saying,
the
yeah,
IT side,
mm,
absolutely. Like, do we have to disclose is one of the first questions from a response
mhm,
perspective, and there isn't that same calculus on the OT side.
yeah, because
I think
typically,
one other important thing
mhm,
to think about is, and we have this problem. Well, two quick thoughts. We have this problem on the IT side as well, which is I don't think anyone understands the overall systemic risk,
yeah,
like what the dependencies of the piece parts are and what a failure in one piece means to the implication of another piece. I mean, we saw that in the financial
mhm,
um,
yes,
issues where no one knew that credit default swaps were going to cause a cascading set of failures.
yeah,
And so understanding now that the OT systems and IT systems have dependencies upon one another and understanding the systemic risk, I think is critically important. The other
mhm,
thing about getting your earlier question, getting vendors to be able to design security in or produce systems that are secure. In the end, I mean, it has to come down to some kind of business dollar
yeah,
motivation. And so I studied software engineering and learned that you can mathematically prove the completeness of a program. The problem is the cost to prove the completeness of a program is expensive. It takes a long time to
mhm,
do and a lot of computational cycles, and not a lot of people can do it. So there has to be a business justification for a company who, if they wanted to build a mathematically provable, secure system, that there has to be some upside for
mhm,
taking that time. And so, really, to me, ultimately, what that will come down to is it will have to be market driven some way. The market will
mhm,
have to demand or have companies
yeah,
compete on their systems from a security perspective, and to some degree even be willing to pay more to get a system
mhm,
that's designed securely. And there might be long-term economics there to the consumers of the system where maintenance is cheaper, but the cost
Mhm.
up front is a little bit higher. And so it has to come down to the economics at some point.
Absolutely. And it could also be compliance and regulation. It could also impede it as well. That, or certain organizations and industries have no option but to do it. And we've seen, of course, executive orders coming out from the U.S.
Yeah.
government administration that really is kind of pushing in that direction. That you will have to do. You can no longer ignore security, especially in
Yeah.
OT. And my concern is that a lot of these OT companies, where it used to be much more isolated vendor supplies. Now they're dependent much more IT side of the technology as well, such as
Yeah.
DNS, which we've seen major outages recently as well. You can have those cascading impacts where you might have one company who's really kind of heavily reliant, even though they might be a small vendor, but they might be heavily reliant on the entire system and process. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I'm hoping that I'm excited at seeing this evolution because it's definitely going to benefit society in entirety. It makes us all more connected. It makes our lives much more benefited from all of these things that have been automated. But at the same time, I do get worried at the security risks. Especially dealing with a lot of them firsthand and responding to them. Like yourselves, we get to see sometimes in the backgrounds, what's happening and some of the lack of security implementation or thought process. What kind of just kind of getting into the kind of summaries and final thoughts. Kind of where do you see this going in the future? What do you think the next steps would be? For does to your point, John, does it take that economic factor or compliance? Who should be, let's say, who should be initiating this discussion going forward? Who should be accountable and responsible for making this happen?
So Joe, that's kind of the $1 million question, right? Because
Yes.
because right now, yeah, because right now the reality it is completely siloed. You have the
Yes.
OT professionals in charge of the running the critical networks and sometimes even owning them, right? So they are the ones sometimes
Hmm.
paying for their own infrastructure, and then you have the IT cybersecurity savvy personnel defining and designing policies, right? And then policies apply across the board to any networks in those organizations. So that's the challenge, right? Still very siloed. So I think uh, unless there's an acknowledgement that
Hmm.
the solution is a holistic approach, is an ITOT integrated solution, uh, the adversaries are still gonna enjoy the
Hmm.
benefit that they have today. Because the network is all connected, right? So
Yes.
they're completely at an advantage when they try to attack a network that have multiple
Hmm.
vulnerabilities available for them, and the groups defending the networks are completely divided, in their priorities.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a holistic approach. I think that there's a lot of uh, better understanding right now what needs to be done. There's
Hmm.
great technologies available in the industry that you can use to protect your networks. So it's not necessarily a lack of technology; it's more a lack of integration. I think an integration between OT and IT professionals that they need to define standards that are
Hmm.
compatible and useful. Policies need to be thinking about beyond compliance, in my opinion. Compliance is just checking the box, if you
Yes.
will, and sometimes that doesn't mean that you're secure. Think about going to the doctor in a yearly basis for your physical, right? I mean, that's a compliance check the box.
Doesn't
That
doesn't
doesn't
make you
mean that you're
healthy.
going to be healthy. Yeah, that doesn't make you healthy per se, right? I mean, you need to eat well, you need to exercise, you need to do all the things. So that's the
Mhm.
difference between compliance and
Yeah.
security. So it's almost like a cultural shift, but I see it coming. I see
Mhm.
these podcasts. I see a lot of technologies coming. So there's things that are improving. We just
Mhm.
need to keep pushing on the integration of ITOT, in my opinion.
Absolutely, and I agree to your point.
Yeah.
Compliance and regulations. It's a measurement in time. It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean you're better or worse. So, John, you were saying that's right.
Yeah, no, and I think from a corporate responsibility perspective, there's lots of sort of there's standard of care, there's right to
Mhm.
exist, there's other types of models used in different areas that I think we need to apply in this space. And you, and I think a corporation or a business who has the responsibility of operating and maintaining and designing and building and procuring these kinds of OT, IT capabilities need to put together, in my opinion, some mechanism where you can bridge the divide between safety and availability and confidentiality and availability. So you
Mhm.
need an IT person, you need an OT person, you need a procurement person who can make sure and drive the risk conversation when procuring things. And I think you need a risk person who can think about this, represent this in a way that's a systemic risk to the
Mhm.
organization and both of the environments coming together, and also help facilitate the conversation of how to mitigate the risk between both environments, and then make that conversation and the results of that conversation effectively a board level conversation, maybe at the audit
Mhm.
level, but certainly this needs to be talked about because there's going to be money needed one way or another, and there's going to be talented needed, and it's not going to fix itself. And so, like, getting proactive by putting a group
Mhm.
together that can show some corporate governance over this is where I think it needs to start.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need to turn on the silos. I think, just like the government's put together the Joint Task Force for Ransomware, I think we really need some type of task force that's for OT
It's
and
brilliant.
IoT. I think that's really where we need to start really considering. I think the great thing is we're having these discussions. We're bringing them up to the surface, and I think that's where a lot of it's happened over the last few years. And we've seen major incidents occur, and therefore it's got a lot of focus. But I think we really need to start bringing down those silos. We need to have joint cooperation. And to both your points, we definitely need IT and OT and risk and compliance and the board all working together to find what's the priorities and goals and what's the way forward. So
Yeah.
definitely valuable points, and hopefully anyone who's we do have a lot of people listening to these podcasts, so hopefully one of those listening will help maybe trigger some of those initiatives, because I think we need to go beyond executive orders and really getting into really joint collaboration, joint working together. Think tanks that's really looking at this from a future perspective, because my concern is that you know we'll always wait for the next incident to happen, and then we take that as the move forward or the step forward. We want to be more proactive here, and I think that's what our discussions are all about. So both John, Juan, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. For the audience, I really hope this has been exciting and interesting. I think this is a space that we might have more discussions on in the near future, because this is definitely one of the biggest areas in security, where we're starting to see a more impact, as we start seeing those convergence, more devices connected. So, any final thoughts? Any final words, John? Juan? Anything that you would like to sum up?
Yeah, I think that the future holds a lot of good things. I think that universities are listening. There's
Hmm.
a wave of new cybersecurity professionals. So when I said at the beginning that security was an afterthought, maybe not anymore. Maybe the
Hmm.
new generations already are aware of the risks. You don't need to convince company owners anymore that they have a risk. So I'm optimistic on the future. There's a wave of new education, new resources that none of us really had before 20 years ago.
Yeah,
So I think it will be much better and much safe and protected world in the future.
absolutely well said, John.
Nothing to add. Thank
Nothing,
you.
nothing to
Well
add.
said, one.
So, yeah,
Nothing to
absolutely.
add.
I don't think we can add any more to that. I think that was a solid ending point. So, but absolutely, very kind of pleasure having you both on the show. Hopefully, we'll be able to welcome you back again in the near future. For the audience, this is 401 Access Denied, and one of your leading podcasts, award-winning podcasts that really helps bring very, very educational, valuable topics to you, so you can actually stay up to date, stay in the know, and get educated as much as we possibly can. Tune in every 2 weeks. Make sure you subscribe, so you can get continuously updated, and look forward to seeing our guests on future shows. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and take care.